Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure having you here today with us on this webinar about our lab, Spatial Analysis and Simulation Lab and Community, SASL. And actually, today we're going to have really an interesting topic with a distinguished scholar together with us. But before we start or dive into our webinar, let's introduce ourselves a little bit further. This is our website, which is the Spatial Analysis and Simulation. We're a young research lab. We're dealing with trying to understand the city from the spatial lens of perspective. And we're hosting a lot of webinars. Actually, these are our previous webinars with great scholars. And we are also, as well as having workshops. We have developed workshops in Porto, Portugal, and in Italy, more than 2 of them. And we're dealing with evacuation, tracing urban evolution, understanding the street network, and also as well, we're dealing with photogrammetry, trying to understand the scene itself from a 3D perspective. We do have our own simulation methods and tools and automation as well. We have software called Hayes, which is an open source. If you wish to use it for Spacescape, it's all about all the functions of the Spacescape in Python. You can use it in Colab. And we have also as well global engagement and relationship with the UAE, with the ISOCARP, and also with local municipalities as well. So this is in a nutshell what we are doing, and our research are dealing with the spatial analysis, either by using simulation or gathering tools and gathering information from the real site using computer vision or using even traditional way, and trying to analyze the data using different layers of analysis, in addition to try to find or predict or forecast an event or a movement or a behavior, or try to find a pattern. This is in a nutshell what we are doing. But let's move to the most important part of our webinar today, which is actually our guest speaker. We are thrilled to host Lars Marcus, professor in urban design at Chalmers University of Technology. And today's topic actually is about how spatial capital can enhance and create resilience in urban process. There is the biography of Lars Marcus is huge and really interesting. And currently there is this is really marvelous book. Actually, I'm encouraging you to download, and it's open, it's free. It's called Measures and Meanings of Spatial Capital, Contributions to a Theory of Land. It's really fascinating. Let's go to the biography of Lars Marcus. He's an architect and professor of urban design at Chalmers University of Technology, leading the research group of Spatial Morphology Group, SMoG. His research concerns how spatial form, as defined by architecture and urban design, supports structures and set limits to people's everyday life, and in extension, how spatial form conditions vital social, economic, and ecological urban processes, such as social integration, local markets, and urban ecosystems. Spatial urban form is a technology that creates a spatial structure for other urban systems. Is also the founder and partner of Spacescape consultancy firm, performing spatial analysis, design support, and policy development in architectural and urban projects for architects, municipalities, and real estate companies. Please welcome us with us, Professor Lars Marcus, and we are really happy that that you accepted to be here with us. And thank you. And the floor is yours. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Nabil. That was very kind words, and I'm so grateful to be invited to this network community of the thing that we all are very excited about, you know, spatial analysis and trying to understand its effects on social life, urban life, the economy, but also the ecology, maybe in extension, and all of these things that we look at. So I'm so happy and I'm very grateful to be invited. And not least if it's an opportunity to talk about this book that you said very nice things about. But it has been a work that I've spent a lot of time doing. I've been writing on it for a very long time, because I think, at least that's my experience, that in research you have at times difficulty on making the larger connections between different projects you're working with. So it becomes easily rather fragmented, and it's difficult to see the bigger picture of how things hang together and so forth. And I really think there is so much done now, also on this very detailed scale of the morphology of cities and so forth, that is important also to try to communicate to other disciplines working with cities, because I think there's a lot of connections possible to make there, because increasingly disciplines in academia are interested in cities, not surprising with increasing amounts of people living in cities. But I think there is not always that proper investigation of the spatial dimension or the description or the more precise analytics and measurements of cities that I think we've developed, like in your community and many others around the world. So I think there's a great potential there if making that connection. So that is one major aim of the book, trying to also relate issues of urban space in other disciplines to the kind of morphological analysis that we, both you and I, are doing. So that's one major theme. And also, of course, in relation to that, trying to emphasize the importance of urban planning and design in supporting society and the different processes in cities and so forth. It's not just about creating new housing as fast as possible. It's about creating the environment where we all live and spend our everyday lives in, and how that also supports society in general. So it's also another aim of the book has been to try to, I guess, maybe promote the practices of urban planning and design and the importance of them in general society. And one way of trying to summarize that has been in this concept of spatial capital, trying to address some fundamentals in economics without me being at all an economic expert, but having tried to address some of these issues more, and realizing that we are really working in situations where we influence the economy a lot, both as academians and as practitioners in working on urban space. So that's the background to the idea of spatial capital. So now I'm on it again. Okay, so the background is, of course, these kinds of landscapes that I find absolutely fascinating. This is the city of Gothenburg, or the central parts of the city of Gothenburg, where I work. I live in Stockholm, actually, but I find it very fascinating, as I'm sure you do too, to look at landscapes like this, where you, at the bottom of things, you have the natural landscape, but you also see how people for a long time have invested energy and knowledge and resources of all kinds to try to adapt that kind of landscape into, a way of living. Gothenburg is not that old. I'm speaking with you now that have quite different time horizons. But here it's 400 years, at least in Gothenburg. Stockholm is about 800 years. And of course, these investments done over time are not just a neutral background. They are trying to adapt things, to human life and so forth in general, but of course also to larger processes in society. So in this case of Gothenburg, I think it's quite clear. You see, it's kind of very much a 20th century industrial landscape, and all the kind of ideals and the demands that kind of society put. There are also important parts from the kind of welfare state building in Sweden in that time, with rather ambitious housing areas. But a lot of this structure is, of course, today creating a lot of problems, because they're supporting things in a direction that maybe we want to change these days into more sustainability, both socially, but not least environmentally. This is the reason I talk about it. One reason why I talk about it as a spatial capital. and capital in the sense of the old-time idea in economics of some kind of embodied labors into tools and machines and even buildings, but also urban landscape that kind of enhances future labor. But it does so in a particular direction. I mean, this is still working towards the now a bit old-fashioned industrial landscape that the city like Gothenburg wants to get across and change into something new. But of course, it's a tremendous inertia in this and to try to do that. And at times, I think already on this level, politics of today do not see the necessity to fully address this landscape if we are to transform into something else, hoping for other tools to do that and so forth. But of course, this is also the reason why it constitutes such a value, also an economic value. So it has also in that sense, you can talk about this as a capital. In a sense, it's accumulated value, of course, just as it's embodied labor. And I like these two kind of things and as a foundation for the idea of what I call spatial capital, which is, it's the built environment we're talking about. It's just a word whereby I try to connect it to also some of the social sciences and politics and so forth. And just to be a little bit clear on this, what I mean by that, so we can go back to the idea of capital, which is one of the fundamental production factors in classical political economy, and still is, of course, even though maybe they are less talked about these days than they were 200 years ago when Adam Smith and those people were talking about the economy. And what's emphasized there is, of course, labor. I mean, human labor. That's the foundation of all production. But also capital in different senses, and I come back to that. But also land, of course, not least in the form of natural resources and so forth. And both capital and land needs a little bit of a further description, especially if I now talk about spatial capital to be more precise. Land comes in two very different forms, actually. On the one hand, as natural resources, as I said, it can be oil or minerals, or it can be timber in the woods, it can be fish in the sea, it can be, all these glorious things that nature provides for us. On the other hand, land can be just spatial extension. I mean, the surface of the planet, so to speak. That is the extension of land that we are given. And that's the other dimension of land. And of course, that's necessary for everything we do to take place and so forth. So land is a bit confusing in this sense as a production factor because it has two very, very different ways of showing itself. And I will, of course, talk much more here about land as spatial extension and not much less about natural resources, although we realize how important that is in current sustainability debates and so forth. So I will focus on land as spatial extension. But also capital comes in several forms, and that's what I touched on already. Normally, we think of it as some kind of accumulated value. Most often, we see it in money, but it can, of course, be other things too. But the other dimension of capital, which was equally important and maybe more often referred to in earlier economic theory, older economic theory, is capital as a embodied labor, tools and machines. And of course, in the development of the industrial age and the production forms of capitalism and so forth, it's not just about money and accumulation of value. It's another dimension of this is the tremendous development of technology, of course, that we have seen for the last 200 years. So that's another dimension of capital. Again, rather confusing because it's quite very different things. So if I talk about spatial capital now, I need to be more precise. And even embodied labor, capital as embodied labor can come in many forms. As I've touched upon, it can be tools, it can be machines, it can be buildings. It's often referred to as buildings, or also in the old text of Adam Smith and so forth. And of course, an extension of that, also different types of infrastructures like street systems or road systems or railroads and all these things that we have. So now maybe I can be a little bit more precise what I mean by spatial capital. With spatial capital, I mean the types of capital in the form of embodied labor that are tied to land. It's a huge difference between a building and a street network than from a machine or a simple tool or a computer or something like that, right? Some we can carry with us and so forth. We can buy a new one. We can repair it in different ways, whatever we do, but we cannot carry around buildings and street networks as easily. And if one go deeper into that, these two, the buildings and infrastructure, what I call spatial capital, have very, very particular properties, and I evolve on that a bit in the book. But the most obvious is, of course, that it's tied to land. So location becomes part of these entities. So there's no particular location to a particular tool. It can be carried around, but a building is located somewhere. And this becomes very important and makes a very big difference in this. So this is, in simple terms, what I mean by spatial capital. But also touching a little bit on the value of spatial capital. Values can be of different kinds. Of course, one thing is use values, and that's, I think, is what we normally think of, especially in practice. We try to create environments for humans, housing areas or public spaces that are useful and attractive and work well for people. And I think also that's also something we often address in academia. I heard all these layers that you were talking about created when you investigate how particular places have certain qualities and people tend to do certain things and all of that. And more generally, that would be some kind of use values. The space has some kind of use value. But of course, on the other hand, we can also talk of values in more strict economic terms or monetary terms, of like real estate values. And I think it can be important to emphasize the tremendous the size of the economic values of the things that we work with, because it constitutes more or less, if you look at things like global wealth, what humanity has been able to amass in assets of different economic assets of different kinds, 2/3 of that is real estate globally. So it's a tremendous field we work in, and I think that is sometimes forgotten, and we in that way may run the risk of marginalizing the importance of the thing we study and the thing that we produce in practice. It's a tremendous value, also in monetary terms. And of course, it's also super important for the everyday lives of people and so forth. So, I mean, we're in the right place in our studies and in our teaching and all of what we're doing. Anyway, there's two sides to this. And moreover, when you look at real estate value, trying here, what I'm aiming for here is see if we could find ways to also somehow start to describe these values, and not only the use values, which I think in space syntax and so forth done a lot, but also try to get a little bit closer to these real estate values. Interestingly, a real estate value is constituted by two things. First, of course, the land in itself. But the land in itself, the value of the land in itself, without any buildings or anything, is to absolutely dominant part constituted by its location. We easily realize that a piece of property varies in value very much due to its location, whether it's in this city or in that city, or in this part of the city or in another part of the city. That makes a huge difference for the value of the land. And of course, we all have heard the thing about the three things that make up the value of land. It's location, location, and location. So we come back to that. And of course, location in a city is to a very, very high degree defined by the street network that makes the accessibility to other different places, but also in a sense defining the location locally between different places within a city. I mean, this is what we do if we do space syntax very much. We analyze that. How things are related to other, how they are accessible. And another way of describing that is saying that it defines locations. If we leave other things out for a moment, like where all the people are living and all the goods and things happening, but the structure in itself is defined very much by the configuration of the street network, as we often address in space syntax and so forth. But it's not only land, it's also different types of land improvements, as the real estate economics call it, which primarily are buildings, but there can be other forms of landscaping. It can be simple fences. It can be, making irrigation systems or whatever. It can be a lot of things that we do with land. But the normal thing that most often we see in cities especially is, of course, buildings. So in this sense, it's rather interesting. We can summarize real estate values to, on the one hand, be dependent on the street network, and on the other hand, on the buildings. And then, of course, we could take the next step and ask, how could we describe these two things to make it more clear how they contribute to real estate values? And of course, we have some clues already, repeating now the space syntax thing, but there are other ways of doing this in GIS and so forth. But we could start to measure things. And the title of the book is Measures and Meanings of Spatial Capital. So I start here with trying to be more precise on how could this be measured. And later on, I hope I also have the time to touch a little bit on what I mean by the meanings of spatial capital. So we have two things. On land values, that is the location, is very much defined by street networks that create location, we could say, through accessibility. On the other hand, we have land improvements, which are buildings that add floor space. They intensify certain locations so they can be more intensely used. What we see when we see very tall buildings in central parts of large cities, of course. So let's start with the street network. And as you well know, this is very much about not so much only looking at the particular space, but rather looking at how they are related to each other. And you're familiar to this, so this is no news. But if we imagine a very simple city in the image to the right here, with a few streets that connects some different city districts, we realize that when people start to move in different forms in the city, this will shape and color the different city districts in different ways. The ones in the periphery will be very different from the ones more centrally, because there will be more people passing through the more central parts than in the parts in the periphery. And even though we would propose, like I've done here in a bit, as a joke a bit, they would be rather different. Even though they would be identical from in the beginning, over time they're likely to change very much, and the character and the quality of these different districts or neighborhoods would be very different. And all of this is very familiar to you. And of course, that means that we have to have some way of measuring the relation here if we are to understand the impact of the street network when it comes to creating location and thereby creating spatial capital, as I talk about it. And as you also well know, the one key way of doing this is through measuring the centrality of the system or the network. So we simply measure how close a particular location is to all other locations in the system, rather than a regular distance measure where you measure the distance from A to B, as you see to the left. You do what you see to the right, that measuring the mean distance from A to all other places. And again, I'm sorry, this is all familiar to you, but I'm just sometimes I talk also to other communities. And again, if we bring this together, we get some of these typical space syntax maps. And this is a rather old one, as you can see, there is from my PhD. So I just like to show it. It works well. There are many developments since that, as you well know, so we can do a lot of other things. But basically, it does the similar thing, right? It kind of measures the centrality of different street segments or axial lines, if you work in more traditional axial maps, and thereby describing the relation between the different street segments or axial lines and their location in the system. And in this case, it's part of Stockholm, central part of Stockholm. We see the typical effects of finding certain streets being far more centrally located in the system than others that are far less. And then, of course, we also find the effect of this to a very high degree correlates also to how people move in these spaces. And as you know, it's not always the same high correlation here. It depends on many other things too. But generally speaking, we find these correlations in all kinds of situations coming back in many different cities and different districts in cities. But we should keep in mind, of course, that it does vary, and at times other things overrun the effects of the configuration of the street network. But basically, you're familiar to this way of measuring, and it simply is a way of, to my mind, then to describe the street network and describe the fundamentals of location. Location can be added a lot of things here depending on what's going on in these different places and what people are living there and what they're doing, and all of these things gets a lot more quality to it. But fundamentally, a simple space syntax analysis of this kind captures a lot of these location qualities, and thereby could be very important also to describe fundamental real estate values. Moving now, touching briefly then on the street network, I also want to move to the buildings, and this is some developments that we have done in Sweden, both early at KTH in Stockholm, but also more lately at Chalmers, developing ways to use the space syntax approach to also capture dimensions of the actual buildings, not least density. So what we've done to do that, since we know that density, even though it's the most common way to describe cities and often very useful, of course, it can also be a bit confusing, and it's often not capturing the more concrete qualities of urban space. All these three, yeah, I'm sure you've seen images like this, have the same density, but they are very different urban situations, of course, and have very different qualities and properties that will shape and structure urban life in different ways, but still they have the same density. So density, the way we usually measure it, is of course useful, depending on what question you have. At time, I think it's important to emphasize that fundamentally it is a exploitation ratio. It's part of actually real estate economics, very much a way of seeing how much we can exploit a piece of land, so we can make a good economic calculation of that. It's not very much of a kind of urban design or urban planner tool if we are aiming to create particular qualities. But still, of course, it can be very useful. But the simple thing we have done is to try to incorporate measurements of density into a space syntax analysis. And it's rather simple. If we have the same typical type of measurement of density, as you see to the left here, in this case, rather high resolution. There's the density calculated for each parcel of this piece of land or this district in the city. And we get a certain pattern, of course. But we could, we have argued, apply this to a space syntax analysis using the axial map or whatever street network we use in our modeling, and weigh the different street segments or the different axial lines depending on the amount of built floor space you have adjacent to it. I'm sure you're doing similar things in your analysis too, using different GIS tools and so forth. But here is actually also using this kind of more particular measurements that you find in space syntax with the rather odd way of measuring distance with angular distance or topological distance of axial lines. And it's rather unusual if you go to other disciplines, but has proven very useful. So that's the thing we use here. And if we weigh that with the same density data we have, we get an image something like this, where of course then we can say that it's measuring not density anymore, but accessibility to floor space. So it's not really density of floor space anymore, but accessibility to floor space. So this image is actually showing from each and every parcel how much floor space you can access within a radius of, in this case, 800 meters. And you, as you know, you can set the radii as you like. And of course, also following the street system. So it's not any kind of as the bird fly distance. So this is then, to my mind, a way that one could describe the building or the land improvement part of real estate value. So if we could bring them together, as in this image from Gothenburg, we have two layers that together make up this kind of measurement. In this case, you see the street network, and now it's not axial lines anymore, it's a road center line. And the centrality of each and every street segment measured as angular distance and all these things that I'm sure you know, in the yellow to brown range there. In blue, it's the accessibility to build floor space. In this case, I think within a radius of 500 meters. But it still captures very well how that is distributed, and it also shows that they do not completely follow each other. We have places where we have high centrality in the street network, but very little built floor space, and also the opposite. So these together could then be used, to my mind, this is my argument, to measure spatial capital, or describe it as a measurement. And in a sense also it could be connected to both use values. Of course, we could start to interpret what the potential of different spaces have here for urban life, but also as a way of measuring fundamentals of the real estate value. These are things that change slowly. There are other things changing fast and so forth. But this is something that remains for a very long time. And that is the thing that I've chosen here to talk called spatial capital. I mean, it's the built environment fundamentally, as I said earlier. But this is a way to measure that. And these two fundamental dimensions that is also acknowledged in real estate economics. Of course, it's not capturing the whole real estate value. It's more trying to capture a fundamental part of it, and something we also can influence over in long-term perspectives in urban planning and urban design. So this is why I try to isolate these kind of this part of the city and even this part of the built environment. There's a lot of other things that we could bring in, but then the model becomes very complicated and we have everything going on at the same time. This, I think, is something that remains over long term. And also to touch briefly on that, because I maybe don't have the time to really get into it, it's a thing due to its inertia and its slow change over time that creates resilience in the otherwise very complex system of cities, of course. I learned, I spoke of resilience for a long time until someone pointed out that, yes, resilience is important, but you know that resilience is a typical property of a complex system. So the kind of paradoxical thing here is that cities are typically complex and thereby rather, unpredictable. That's what we say. I mean, complex is we don't really know what's going on. But if one stops to think about it, it's the strange thing with cities, thinking about how many people spend every day, millions of people in the same city doing all kinds of crazy things. And the strange thing is almost how predictable they are, that things tend to repeat itself, that there is some kind of stability in all of this complexity. And that stability, it was pointed out to me, that is resilience. That is the resilience of a complex system. So all complex systems, even though they are supposedly very unpredictable, which they of course are, they also have this property of having a stability. And that is what's called resilience. So resilience is a property of complex systems. And the most fantastic and most most complex system there is of course cities, where we have millions of humans spending their lives and doing all kinds of things. So in that sense, I think spatial capital here also have this conditioning purpose of creating resilience in a city, and therefore it's also very important that when we plan and design it, we do it in a proper way, or we may lose this resilience property in the city, which can be very unfortunate. But of course, also it means that our studies of this, academic study of it, is very important to understand what creates resilience and not in cities. So this again is arguing for that there's so many things we could describe in a city, and there's even very, very much we could describe in a city as a built environment. But I tried to isolate certain fundamentals that seems to be very, very important and that are there on the long-term stretch, and something that we could capture and describe. And even maybe value in monetary terms then. So also saying something that but I'm rather proud of this very large study that we did at Chalmers, empirical study of the correlations between different centrality measures of street networks in these different locations and the presence of pedestrian movement in these. So we did some years ago a very large study in 3 European cities, London, Amsterdam, and Stockholm. We visited 53 areas in these cities and 846 different observation points, where we read anonymous Wi-Fi signals from mobile phones. And these kind of things develop very rapidly now. There's so many things we can do. But we did back then, and it was a very large study. And throughout the 3 different cities, very different districts within the cities, different locations within the districts and so forth, we had a final result of a correlation of 0.65, as you can see at the bottom. And we had some other variables of closeness to public transport and certain things. But the very, very dominant thing was the centrality value of the street system, which correlated very highly to pedestrian traffic then. So I think that this is just a contribution to the proof of that we have something in these descriptions that really seem to work. And must have something to do with these rather unique ways of measuring this distance, because as we know, just doing a simple metric distance measure wouldn't work. We wouldn't capture anything. So this is just a contribution to that. And of course, then we can bring this together, and it was fun to make one of London, since London is in space syntax is such a repeated case, as you know, Nabil. And just showing also, so in red here you have the street, the centrality of the street network on street segments, but you see in our more particular contribution is the grayscale pattern in the background, which is the accessibility to floor space from each and every parcel in London to each and every other parcel in London. So you have both of these going on. On the one hand, you have the land, on the other hand, the land improvements. So you can bring it back to that. I don't know now if I'm talking too long. I would like to get into a little bit on the meanings. Am I talking too?
No, please take your time. We are enjoying the presentation, so please take whatever the time you need.
Okay. No, but also to get to the meanings of this, because now it's a lot about measurement, and a lot of this you already know, but maybe there are some contributions, new contributions here. But the point is, of course, so what does this matter really to people in cities, and also the larger processes taking place in cities? It's not just about enjoying some nice place in the square when having a coffee, and that's important too. But there is also larger things happening in cities. So of course we have applied that to very many different fields, and maybe mostly worked in social system. We have a huge problem. One thing we shouldn't need to have a problem with it, but we do have a problem with social segregation in many of our larger cities in Sweden. And I think it's part because we've been very consistent in the kind of neighborhood planning of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth, which has created a spatially very segregated city, clearly. And of course, that supports also a socially segregated city. And there's a lot of things one could say about this, and it remains a very important issue in Sweden. So we, of course, applied research to that. Another one is more to the right here, is maybe more obvious also, that we can identify different markets or different types of markets within the city. A city is really a kind of a continuous market of different sizes and different character of markets and so forth. And again, the spatial distribution of these are likely to be quite conditioned by the accessibility in the street network and so forth, of course. More recently, we've been doing this for a while too. We have been trying to also address ecosystems in cities. That is not just the green structure as some more what do you say? Well, for people to spend time in green areas, or there's a park or something like that. But actually, we have a lot of living and functioning ecosystems in cities. Depending on this varies in different cities, but many Swedish cities are quite green, and you have a lot of ecological life taking place in these. And they do a lot, as you know, when you come to things like ecosystem services. They clean air and they clean water, and they create more humid air and so forth. So there's a lot of things going on. So if we can keep these green areas alive and maybe even improve them in urban planning and design, it's a very nice thing, of course. Of course, then a lot of things changes. It's not humans moving anymore, but maybe birds or insects or whatever. And maybe we don't want all of these animals. But some of them we also appreciate, like birds and so forth. So, and they are important to keeping the ecosystem hang together. So from that point of view, we could also bring in other species than humans and see how the built environment allow them to move, or whether they create hindrances for that. And of course, you can have traffic barriers. This is difficult in many situations, of course. But in principle, we just wanted also to bring in this dimension of the city, and also to get the both social, economic, and ecological systems in cities. So, and there's a lot of work you need to do if you really are going to do this, but we are pushing on and doing a lot in that direction, even though it demands more research and so forth. But just to illustrate, of course, how this works, of course, and from a more social and economic point of view, the importance of this. And now we're getting close to these studies. I saw some of that you were showing, Nabila. I mean, what's happening in different spaces and so forth. And just making the argument that is quite obvious to you that in certain spaces we are able to gather certain numbers of people passing, and this is not just a traffic thing, of course, of people having to move. It's a situation of co-presence where people for a moment share space with each other, which actually is a fundamental thing in any society to keep the society hang together, so to speak, that people meet and get an opportunity to become aware of each other. And these things are very different in different public spaces. So this is the most centrally located in Gothenburg, and it's Gothenburg is not a huge city, but in this place you can have maybe 5,000 people an hour when it's the peak hour. And it's one of the few places where you can get a sense that Gothenburg, well, it is a pretty large city, you know. It's look at all these people, and for a moment you can sense that you are in a we are in a large city. So this is kind of the public sphere, the publicness of this. There's a public gathering, so to speak, so in sociological terms, and that is of course argued a lot in certain sociological traditions to be very important to create social cohesion. It's also rather easy to sense that this place does not only gather a lot of people, but it actually gathers people from very large parts of the city, very different parts of the city. So people from different communities, so to speak, come together and for a moment share the space and become aware of each other. And that's a fundamental function, of course, of this analysis that you can to make this clear, and that is also contributing to fundamental parts of society. But just if we move a little bit to the side of that central part, not so far, a little bit to the side of the most central part, in another place in Gothenburg, we have far less people, even though we're quite still very close to the center, maybe only 500 people an hour. It's a very quaint and popular place. It's kind of pretty with old wooden houses and so forth. And it's popular also for tourists to visit. But for the people living there, it's a rather small community and there's less people moving in the street. In this case, maybe people even know each other. It's a very different kind of thing. It's a more of a small town feeling within the same city. And of course create a different kind of community and sense of community, of sharing space. Clearly, you are not meeting people from everywhere in Gothenburg anymore. It kind of makes a selection so that there's a different set of people meeting here that is more from around this area of the city and so forth. So it's a different community and so forth. And then if we move to one of these newly built areas in maybe 20 years old in Gothenburg, more in the periphery, kind of more isolated. It's a very high quality when it comes. You have a view of the sea, you have some industrial memories, you have kind of large investments in the public spaces, but there's not many people around. There's maybe 50 an hour. And most of the people moving here probably live in this housing area. In economic terms, there's not much going on. Maybe there is a small restaurant. You can order a pizza, maybe a sushi, or I don't know, kebab, whatever, but very small scale. Whereas in this area, you have a lot of small, in economic terms, you have a lot of small self-owned shops of various kinds, very attractive. And in this situation, of course, in economic terms, you have the big brands, you have McDonald's and so forth and so forth. So again, what they also create these locations are markets, of different sizes. So this is a big market. We have the big brands, and this is a smaller market. Of course, you have this no big brands. This is not an opportunity for them anymore. It's something else. And finally, you get a very scarce, kind of a very small scale market in a sense. So my point here is saying that the spatial form here creates opportunities and certain conditions in different locations that relate to fundamental things in society, like the public sphere, the community building, or markets in economics. Cities are a continuum of markets of different sizes and characters. It's not like saying the city is a place for exchange, one market. It's much more complicated. And it's here that I sense that we could contribute with these very fine scale descriptions also to the disciplines of urban sociology, urban economics, and so forth. In extension, maybe urban ecology. We're not quite there, but they also have this rather rough description of urban space when we talk to them. And so forth. So we see that we could contribute here. And that's the argument that I'm also trying, that the meaning of, if we can measure the spatial capital, we can also create, it can also be very useful for understanding things in other disciplines that also work with cities. Because these days in academia, it's not sociology, economics, and ecology anymore. It's urban economics, it's urban sociology, it's urban ecology. So everybody's interested in the urban. But what is the urban? And I think that is something we can describe. And I think that some of these disciplines are not always so good at that. They use very crude descriptions at times. But here we can do with our tools and our practices and our research contribute to something that could be very important to them. Because and now I'm getting to the end, sorry, so you don't worry. Because it's rather fundamental things in some of these disciplines. I've spent some time trying to read on what's the basics in urban sociology or sociology at all, and economics and so forth. So when sociologists talk, and not least very important people like Émile Durkheim, who more or less is the person who created modern sociology as an academic discipline, he emphasized these things about co-presence of people. He said that there cannot be any kind of social cohesion in a society if you don't allow people to be co-present. It's absolutely essential. And the degree of co-presence and the degree of concentration of co-presence also have effects on the types of societies you get. Now, this is, of course, more than 100 years old and so forth. There's a lot of new ideas about this. But it's interesting to see these fundamental ideas early in the development of sociology. So, of course, he has made this famous study of how societies are kept together in different ways in the more modern and urbanized societies as compared to the more rural and pre-industrial societies where you had a lot lower concentration of co-presence and so forth. And these things could probably be debated, but the point is that he emphasizes to such a degree the importance of the spatial conditions of people. And it's a contribution to this. At times one says that, not least when it comes to economics, it's accused of being a science on the tip of a pin, meaning that there is no space. There are markets, they say. Okay, but where? And where are they located? And there's a lot of so there's a reduction often in these theories where the spatial dimension is not there. And this is again something I think we can contribute. And adding a little bit with that, it was super interesting to read how Émile Durkheim emphasized that any sociology, if we are to develop a discipline of that kind, it has to stand on two legs. On the one hand, something he called social physiology, and on the other hand, something he called social morphology. And social physiology is very much about people and relation to people in different situations. But social morphology is about the spatial conditions for these things. So you see, social morphology, spatial morphology, urban morphology is very close, but it was never developed in sociology properly. This is a super interesting thing I'm just opening the door. It could be something for the future. But the point here is that he emphasizes the need of something that I think that we spend a lot of time doing these days in our research fields. And similarly, this is the last one. When you talk about the early days of economics, it's the same thing, or the early day of urban economics, I should say, where Alfred Marshall was the pioneer, the first one who started to say that, well, look, let's, realizing that the economy in cities is different from the economy in other places. And again, he emphasized the reason is that people are so close to each other, the proximity of people. And this creates what he called agglomeration effects, that there are so many benefits by being close to other people, close to other businesses and so forth. And he listed some of these benefits, which also having businesses in cities, generalizing, of course, often much more productive for certain you can specialize much more, you can rely on other businesses that can support you with things that you are not doing well and so forth, and all of these kind of things. And he emphasized this again, different types of markets. He talked about the labor markets are of course large, and if a city has a certain profile, which they still have, but maybe even had even more in the 100 years ago when he was. Then you have people that are trained in certain disciplines and so forth. And so you have a very trained and very large labor market. You have also large input markets. Generally speaking, things that you use in your own production and you want to buy, it's close by. You can have supportive industries. Often these grow up around the large industries and all of this. And then, of course, you have large output markets where you can sell things to people and so forth. And not least, which is maybe more important in our days with the very knowledge-based economy and so forth, you have unique knowledge markets. By being in the right place, you hear about things before others. You have, again, people you can associate with and talk to and learn things from and so forth. I mean, you could think, just to take like Silicon Valley. There's a lot of people around there that knows a lot of the things that's important to people in Silicon Valley. So you have you know when things are happening, and so forth. So again, and this is also again what's making this happen. Well, it's the spatial form of the city, and it's of course not about making everything super central, but creating a resilient landscape that can allow for different marketplaces, for different co-presences between people, but where things still hang together as a whole and so forth. So again, this is the meaning side of the spatial capital discussion that I've tried to elaborate quite extensively in the book in different chapters. So there are thematic chapters of sociology, economics, and ecology, trying to extend this. But then we can bring it all together again and say that they create both use values and real estate values, and these things could be further elaborated, of course, in all kinds of directions. But I think I stop there. I talked too much, and maybe there are some questions.
Well, actually, thank you very much. It's really interesting and valuable. It's really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about the spatial capital as a term and your discussion about it and using case studies, space in economic or economy, space in sociology and ecology. It's really interesting points to highlight. And I would like to leave the floor for our participants here if they would like to raise any questions. But I would like to take the privilege of asking the first question, if I may, so the others could prepare the questions and maybe write them in the Q&A or just raise their hand. Most of us are really focusing on already established cities, and sometimes the established cities are a typical case because the city center and its periphery, they are there for a long time without that much change. I would like to take your insights about cities which have rapid growth. Some of them might be controlled, some of them might not be controlled. So the periphery, at certain point, it become like almost a city center by itself within very few years, and another cycles of peripheries until they just join with another city. And I'm talking here about Cairo as a case study, and even some of African cities that they do have rapid growth. So understanding the special capital, what do you think? Is it going to be within the same scope and length of doing with an already established city, or we should consider other factors when we're dealing with spatial capital?
Are you saying when new cities growing or cities meeting and merging? Or sorry, I was rather than just the city that is already there.
Yeah, a city is already established and have its own rapid growth, sometimes controlled, sometimes uncontrolled. So I'm talking about the
Okay.
peripheries, the layers
Yeah.
of peripheries that they
Yeah.
are maybe challenging spaces to try to apply the spatial
No,
capital.
yes. I think I hope I answer your question, but where I contribute to your discussion. But this is of course fascinating because as somehow there is a fantastic a city creates a certain gravitation. Things are drawn there because things are closer to each other and so forth. But then, of course, as the city grows, we get congestion. We get too many disturbances and so forth, and also creates it difficult for the city as a whole to work as a whole. So even though it may be hang together, it's kind of working in different parts and so forth. And then the full size of the city is not. I guess this is more open discussion. Is not really contributing to the overall attraction of the city. It becomes more a conglomerate of different cities and that hang together certain. And it maybe cannot be differently, and maybe it's not a problem. I don't. It depends and so forth. But what one can observe is, of course, that when cities grow and they become too large, there's this paradox of when cities become too large, we need to make them small again so we can access the different parts, and that the different parts can contribute to the overall attraction of the city, uh, also maybe in competition to other cities and so forth. I'm not arguing that cities just should grow and be the big. It's not meant, but generally, so we have had all these, cases through history where we have you could take the typical case of Osman's boulevards. It's actually made Paris smaller again, right? Because it had been too large, so it was accessible again. It started to work like different pieces, and it kind of brought and lots of investments in public transport, in also car roads of different kinds are trying to do this, of course, trying to make the city small again when it grows. So that's just one observation that I find interesting, and how you do that. First of all, whether you should try to make it smaller again, maybe it's not always the case, but then how you do it is of course very important and so forth. So I don't know if this at all relates to your question.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Thank you, for because actually it's sometimes difficult to deal with a huge city by itself. So it's the idea of trying to find centers or minor centers or satellite centers and trying to have like smaller parts in order to understand them. This is a brilliant point to deal with. There is a question from Randa, if you'd like. Randa, if you'd like to state it.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Marcus, for this outstanding presentation. It was insightful and very informative. I have one question. Could spatial capital help frame a more spatially responsive approach to climate adaptation strategies?
Yeah, I think it's. Thank you for your kind words, and it's a very good question. I think because I think this is one of the things that we have maybe. Well, we're doing it now, but for a long time not talked enough about. And on the one hand, I think I think from this point of view, and the kind of descriptions we can do in the models we build today, that are both comprehensive and also very high resolution. I mean, this is the power we have from digitalization and so forth. We can do these things very well. And then I think, in a sense, and there's so many dimensions to your questions, I think, of how it can relate. But then we can understand that we really already have, so to speak, a spatial capital. We're not just trying, the next step is not just finding an empty space and add something, more of something in that space and so forth. We can see that whole thing as a kind of organism that we rather need to maintain over time, if in best case, if we have the power to do that, and see that we can add certain things in the particular necessary places where things maybe not are working. We have problems already in our cities in Sweden, which are not very large, how things just don't hang together anymore, and you create all kinds of problems. But I think then the problem is that you add things a bit ad hoc, because you don't have this view of how the thing, the system's point of view, that these kind of images that we do in space syntax and other types of tools help us see. And that, I think, could lead to a different way of practicing urban planning and design, that is more of maintaining what we have, adding when it's necessary and so forth, and growing, of course, over time, but not these kind of breaking new grounds and adding things where I think you put a lot of risk when it comes both to environmental and also social sustainability in that. So I think this kind of analysis can contribute to that, and then you could call this a spatial capital or not. But I think there is a point, because it start other people to think about it as also an economic value, as something that is long term, it's not, and so forth. So that's why I think it's useful term, but it's not necessary for the argument, of course.
Thank you so
But
much.
there are many other dimensions. I've
Yes.
touched on the ecosystems and cities, and there's a lot we could do there, but maybe next time.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So other questions, we are open for any other questions. I can see here for the messages, they are thanking us about this webinar. So yes, Mariam, please.
Thank you, Professor, so much for this insightful presentation. My question is about ghost cities, as many ghost cities that may emerge from misaligned spatial planning often. And although they do have infrastructure that they fail to attract sustained economic or societal activities. So how can principles of spatial capital be utilized to repurpose these underutilized urban spaces, especially to ensure a long-term resilience instead of abandonment?
You were talking about underused spaces, was that it? Or sorry, maybe I misunderstood.
Yes, the ghost cities mainly.
The good and you identified then that there are underused spaces that maybe are problematic and not contributing to the good city, or is that the point
No,
of view?
she's referring to ghost cities.
Yes, ghost.
Good cities. Okay. So you were asking whether one could identify something as more good cities and more maybe bad cities that are not working as well. Is that the idea? Or is there kind of an ideal city?
No, the city which doesn't attract anyone, ghost, spirit cities. It's vacant cities. Ghost,
Yes,
yes.
ghost.
Ghost cities.
Thank
Yeah.
So
you.
what do you mean by ghost cities? Sorry.
Yes,
Ghost cities.
yes, ghost cities.
What do you mean, cities that are underused and where people don't spend time in the public space and so forth? Is that what you mean?
It's about some, for example, governmental projects.
Yes. Yes, we have a lot of that in Sweden.
Mhm.
Then I know. No, but I actually, if I understand you right, I think that's a major problem in many Swedish cities, and I think there's many dimensions to that. One is, of course, I think that it's unfortunate when it comes to creating social cohesion in society, where people don't meet. One just meet in the private sphere with people that you know and that you invite and so forth. And you know very little bit about people that is not close to yourself and so forth. And I think that is something in a Swedish context, which is a small country with not so many people and small cities and so forth. You still have these, you start to find these, us and them discussions all the time and so forth, because I think we simply don't meet enough. And you have a lot of these residential areas of different types. You have more high income areas where you have your own house, and you have more low income areas where you have apartment buildings. But they are in the Swedish context often very isolated, and there is not a very so to speak, vigorous public space where people actually meet. Or if you meet people from your own neighborhood, you meet people that are very similar to yourself. There's no large exchange between people. And to my mind, if we get to the other side of that, I think we made a mistake. I really think it was a planning mistake of developing cities in these kind of isolated neighborhood units that was very, very popular in Sweden in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It had high ambitions, as you know, and of creating good living conditions. But I think it kind of contributed to disrupting society. And of course, this is exciting. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I can tell you anyway. There has been a huge difference of change in Sweden. If you go back to the 1950s, I think Sweden was one of most, as far as the population goes, most homogeneous population in the world. People had similar incomes, people had similar educations, everyone shared the same ethnic background. It was a super homogeneous society. So in a sense, when you disperse the cities in small units, I think maybe it didn't matter that much, because it was the same thing going on everywhere, whether they hang together or not. So if you met people in your own neighborhood, you met kind of the same people that was in every neighborhood. But of course, there's been a huge change. We have much larger differences in income. You have a huge amount of people moving into Sweden with other ethnic and cultural backgrounds. So now the different neighborhoods are very, very different. It's not homogeneous at all. And then I think it's very, very problematic when you don't have a space where these different neighborhoods and communities meet. And somehow that was kind of taken away in the 50s, 60s, 70s planning. The ideal was the small local neighborhood, which of course on one level sounds very, very good. I mean, who doesn't want to live in a local neighborhood where you know people and you recognize and people are similar to yourself and all of that. But in a city and in a society, you need to meet people from other neighborhoods, right? That have a different background, that have a different ideas of things and so forth. So there's a big difference there. But I think what maybe you worked in the 50s and 60s in Sweden, I think today contributes to some of the societal problems we have. And in part maybe creating these kind of, in that sense, ghost cities or ghost neighborhoods, where either there is very little people, or if there is people are very similar to each other. And I don't think that's it's not good for it. It's the spatial foundation of society is then not working as well as it should, I think.
Yes, thank you very much. And we have three raised hands right now. We start with Noura, then Heba, and then Walid. Noura, please.
Good evening, Professor Marcus. Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I do have a question which can be divided into two parts. So my first question is, cities, do they have to be homogeneous? I mean, having heterogeneous cities, which is most international cities today are heterogeneous, locations of high-end residential, mid and low-end residential, and having these different, let's say, social sectors living in these different locations. These kind of conditions drive the growth and economy in these cities. And like, how do you perceive future cities? Are we as planners aiming for a utopia where we have homogeneous cities, everyone having the same income as you have mentioned, and having like these perfectly planned locations, or heterogeneity is fine? We should aim for it. And my second question is with regard to benchmarks and analysis tools. I mean, just in your presentation, you mentioned earlier measuring the pedestrian flow in these 3 different locations. But these different locations have different densities, different maybe groups of populations living there. Do they have to generate the same pedestrian flow? Maybe some before we start measuring the pedestrian, we need also to look into the special conditions of these locations. And before starting to compare pedestrian flows between these different locations, we need also to consider the special different conditions. I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly, but are there threshold or benchmarks that needs to be taken into consideration before starting to measure the differences between pedestrian flows, just as like the general benchmarks between these different locations, even though they are completely different?
No, there's very good questions, both of them. And beginning with the last, I think it's clearly the case that was measured here, and what I showed you was on a very, very principal level of the fundamental flows in different spaces. And of course, these are further nuanced, qualitatively nuanced, but depending on where you are and what people you are, and tendencies of all kinds of things of what you do in space and how you move in space, how often you go out of your house, and there's so many things, and then of course you have a lot of different attractions in the cities of all kinds of public and private and so forth that also shapes and structures this and gives all kinds of flavors unique to each and every space. So all of these things is something that one can go much deeper into and describe and analyze. And I think we touched on some of that, but so this is just again doing the basics of trying to describe these fundamentals, because if you don't have any flow of this kind, or the basic flow and the co-presence of people in different locations, you cannot really do magic and try to make things happen in these spaces that simply cannot happen. Whether the benchmarks for these are, I'm probably that sounds like a very good research area to look into that and to get thereby much more qualitative and descriptions of different spaces and the potentials of these and so forth. But I don't have so much more to add to that. But generally, it seems, of course, important and very interesting to do that kind of study. And I'm sure that it's being done and so forth. When it comes to the side of the homogeneous city, I think I just argued for that. I don't think that we should have a homogeneous city. I don't think that if we would say that, I think there's if we see the image we have on the table now with in London, I mean, it has all these different characters adjacent to each other. It's a really, on one level, very confusing thing where each and every space, where each and every neighborhood is quite different from the next one and so forth. And I think that's very useful for cities also to support a more heterogeneous population that you can find. I mean, even in your own lifespan, so to speak, you may prefer different locations if you're able to choose, of course, to live in different parts or different urban settings and so forth. So these create, and then there may be, so it creates all these opportunities. And I think that's specialization that this supports, in that sense, that it's not homogeneous, that is rather diverse, is actually the other dimension of cities that make them to unique places. We often talk about how they are concentrated, how they have high proximity, how they are dense. But I think we often forget that the reason to come together in this close and often congesting and disturbing situation is that you can access difference. You can access something that's different to yourself or your own community or and so forth. So it's this difference is absolutely essential for cities. Without difference or heterogeneity, there's no real reason to live this close, because there's no one else to change things with. And actually, if I may, then you come back to this Durkheimian argument where he said, actually, what happens is the opposite, that when people start to live close to each other, then they start to differentiate or specialize. It creates an opportunity, and he spoke in more economic terms, an opportunity of labor sharing. I can suddenly, like in my case or in your case, you can be planners or you can be urban morphologists and all kind of special things, because there's someone else who bakes the bread and who drives the bus and who does all the other things that are necessary for life to work. But that's only possible when you live close to other people who are specialized in doing other things. So if you live in a much more dispersed situation, you have to be able to do all these things yourself. You have to bake your own bread and you have to, so to speak, drive your own bus. And then you do your urban morphology study, if you have any time left. So I think the diversity is absolutely essential for cities. But when it comes to, equal income and so forth, it becomes more of a political issue. And I don't know how much space can influence on that. But so I leave that one out. But otherwise, I totally think that diversity, heterogeneity in cities is absolutely essential. It's the very reason we are in cities, I think.
Thank you very much. Heba, if you'd like to share your question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nabil. Thank you, Lars, for your presentation. Just a comment on, the 3 cases, and also building on the discussion that has been going on recently. In these questions about the 3 cases that you've shown, the Haga, the central part of Chalmers, and the central part of Gothenburg, and the other one. I think also putting into consideration the proximity to transportation. You have the train station, so just beside the main plaza, or where you have the 5,000 flux of people, and also going in depth of seeing the social background of the users. So whether they are more, as you mentioned, they are more homogeneous or heterogeneous, different groups of people, specifically, of course, the immigrants and so forth. Because if you go, for instance, to Hamakulen, where you find a very high flux of people in a quite remote location, so it's quite you call this the small local towns, but it has a high dense of pedestrian flow of people in there. So it's also interesting to start with the matrix of measuring how many people are there in the space.
Yeah.
But then also to look into the land use, the mobility, and also the social background, or the social composition, demographics of the people over there, and how they are, they usually use space or socialize, how they are, their socialization patterns and so forth. So, and also, one thing is affordability. Because, for instance, if we look at Haga, the uses over there, or the cafes, are a little bit more expensive than those in the central part. So I think this could also contribute to the flux of people over there and the variety or the diversity of people who are using the space. So I'm just intrigued to see the other layers of investigation and analysis when we start with the map and trying to understand the flow of people, and then what are the underlying factors that contribute to that. Thank you for that.
No, but that's terrific, and I'm fascinated by your local knowledge of Gothenburg.
I'm a visiting professor in Chalmers with
Oh.
Rihanna Sofender and for the past 2 years, I've been at Chalmers.
Oh, we haven't met.
Yeah, we haven't, with Liana Thuvander and Holger.
Okay, okay. So it's more the resource. Okay, let's not get. So I hope to run into you soon.
No, yeah, perhaps in a future visit, I will try to meet you. Definitely.
Okay. No, but yes, I think this is absolutely correct. Again, there's of course there's so many varieties and there's so many particularities and there's so many nuances to things and everything. So I mean, in these kind of analysis, you're not proposing that you're capturing actually the urban life of Gothenburg or any other city or any particular neighborhood. Again, maybe this spatial capital term is rather good because it says, well, this is the basic capital, you know, the physical capital that you have. It creates certain potentials and conditions, but of course the variety within that can be very great, depending on who is there and so forth. And also, when it comes to, as you spoke of, other types of infrastructure like train stations and all of these, that of course it has a role in this. But I think so. There's many dimensions. It's the reason to try to isolate kind of this part of the city and even this part of the physical city, not the human city of people, is that I think we have done that very, very little. We are very good at looking at the traffic systems and the train stations and all of these things. There is large models that really can capture how they generate traffic flows and all kinds of things. Very good. But this larger piece actually of the complete built fabric is much less described. And how it creates conditions for people in different situations in the city. And then, of course, one thing may mean a different thing depending on who you are and what ambitions and what you can afford and what you and so forth. So of course it's different for different people, but even so, I think it's still. I think I'm a bit intrigued by sticking to this basic landscape that kind of create the playing field for so much other things, because to my mind, it's strange how ignored it is. And then we start to talk about all the things that happen in cities, and there's so many things, and there's many studies and many disciplines doing this. You know, ethnography, and there's anthropology, and there's so cultural geography. There's so many doing all these studies, but I think they often lack this fundamental description. And that's as an architect, an urban planner, and so forth, urban designer. I think this is the piece we can contribute to that. But that's not saying that it captures everything and this is the end of the story. It's a contribution to that story. That where I think at times we may confuse each other. You know, maybe you know then in Sweden we love to talk about the miljonprogrammet. Have you talked about the million housing program where you know in the 60s? Everybody talks about that. And it sounds like it's the same thing wherever you are. But all of these areas look very different, right? But we are not so good at describing the differences. So in that sense, for instance, to say that, well, this miljonprogram area is different from this miljonprogram. You know, Biskopsgården is different from what did you say? Hammarkullen, for instance. I mean, all of these are different. They have different locations in the city. They're different configured and built in themselves and so forth. But if we can describe them, we cannot see the difference between them. And then we pull them all together and say it's the same thing. And often as you know, in rather negative terms, unfortunately. Yeah. So I totally agree what you say, but I think this at times there's certain contributions we can do from this particular field, so to speak.
Thank you.
I have to talk more if we run into each other.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So last question, Walid.
Yes.
And yes, and please let the question be to the point.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much, Lars, for your interesting presentation and your fantastic work. I just need your elaboration more about this accessible density thing, because I think I maybe misunderstand this. Because if you have like an increased number of floors in the central area, but you cannot really access, you don't have really access to it. Like if you have an office building that's very high, or you have a residential tower somewhere, but you don't really have an access to it. Do you consider it as more accessible at other areas?
Well, no. Oh, clearly, you have a very important point there. It's a lot of this floor space is not accessible, as you say. Of course,
Mm.
in most cases, it's privatized. So it's more saying that, you know, so if you are in a dense area where you have accessibility to a lot of floor space, you're likely also in the public space to see maybe more people, or and so forth. So for instance, so it's not about accessing these buildings for each and every one of us. Maybe in a very broad, urban governance point of view, where you could say that, our city, this contributes to how the city functions, how businesses are working, and whatever. But of course, it's from the individual point of view, it's not accessible floor space. You're absolutely right.
Mhm.
But I think it influences what happens in public space. I mean, so the origin of developing this kind of analysis, which we call place syntax, then, since it's kind of brings a content to space. So it's, space is just in space syntax, you measure the accessibility to space, right? I mean, urban space.
Yes.
So here we have a content, for instance, floor space, but it could be populations, it could be retail, it could be parks, it could be public transport, it could be restaurants, it could be anything.
Mhm.
So using the same thing, you could create all kinds of profiles of different locations on what is close to this location. So it doesn't have to be stick to only floor space. But of course, floor space is a clearly physical dimension. So when I talk about this spatial capital and concept, and say that land improvements has a lot to do with buildings, then floor space comes natural to be what you measure. But as a measure, you can use it for anything. And actually, the origin of developing this is, of course, if you do a space syntax analysis, typical of some kind of centrality measure, you often get a certain correlation to how people move. But it varies a lot. And one reason why it varies a lot is that the density is often unevenly distributed in a city. So of course, even though you have a street like in this one, you can have a street where you have a very high centrality. You don't have a lot of pedestrian movement, because the street is doesn't have good access to built floor space, or so that you don't have any either workplaces or housing close by it. You may note, I don't know if you see my arrow here, there's some large streets that are about dark brown in a central
Yes, yes.
location. But you see it runs through a park,
Mhm.
and it's also rather high speed traffic. So on these streets, you don't get a lot of people moving.
Mhm.
But you also see you have no housing, you have no buildings around it. So it's low access to floor space. So actually, what we developed this first, the accessibility to floor space for, was to increase the predictability or the correlation to movement. Because if you, instead of measuring only the centrality of the street network, if you instead measure the accessibility to floor space using the street network, the way it's done in space syntax, you raised the correlations to movement a lot. And especially in parts of cities where you have an uneven distribution of density, which maybe often is more common in the periphery than in the center. The center is often more homogeneous, depending on what city you are. So you get these typical space syntax correlations without bringing anything in, which is strange in a sense. That you, by only measuring the street network, you capture this. But the reason is that the density then tend to co-vary with the centrality of the street network. So you don't have to bring it in. But in certain areas, it does not. So you have this very uneven distribution of floor space. And then by bringing that in this way, using this measurement, then you can get better correlation. So that's the origin. But fundamentally, you're absolutely right. It's not really accessibility to space.
but yes, I understand it a bit better now. I get your point now. Yes.
Yeah.
That's very good.
And actually, it can be used for, and that could be a way also for these more nuanced analysis that previous people have asked for, where you can bring in all kinds of whatever you have data on, you can make an accessibility analysis, and that's something you can do in a lot of GIS applications. But here we do it using this way of measuring distance, typical for space syntax, that has proven so useful of capturing actually how people move. Otherwise, you get these can be very abstract that, 500 meters from here you have this and that and so forth, but you don't capture. Then you measure distance in a more conventional way. So you can, any data you have, you could make such an and if you were interested, we have tools for doing this. We have something called the Play Syntax tool. We have something new called the Urban Calculator. And if you like, I think I have an end image. If you can enter our.
Yes, I have been working with BST for quite long now. I know of it. Yes, I just wanted to understand it a bit more because I'm still confused when I'm using this analysis. So it was a very good opportunity.
But that's great. Okay.
And actually, Meta has presented the urban calculator in a previous discussion.
Okay. So you know that. Okay, very good.
Yeah. Thank you, Winnie.
But thank you
Lars,
very much.
Thank you, Lars. I don't know if we have extra few minutes because we do have one last question.
Yes, for sure.
Well, actually, thank you, of course, for your valuable time. We are happy being with you. Pekinam has a question here. I don't know if she would like to address it by herself or should I read it, Pekinam, if you wish to address it by yourself. Okay, I'm going to read it. It's yes, please, Pekinam. Yeah, if you'd like.
Yes, hi. Thank you, everyone, for this valuable presentation. I kind of phrased it in the comment section, so I wouldn't take any precious minutes off of your all your valuable times. So my question is as follows. I'm interested to hear your take on how path dependence and heritage trajectories and all that follows in their complex themes can dictate how spatial capital takes form, either positively or negatively. Thank you for your presentation.
I think that's another very good question. There's a lot of good questions here because I think there's tremendous path dependency and inertia in cities. I mean, I think we tend to forget that whatever we do when we start new projects in cities is that 99.9999% of the city is already built, and it's not just a background to what we are doing now. It's pointing and directing things in certain directions already. So I think this is one of the points when we can do these kind of analysis that's very, very useful to realize that we really cannot create anything anywhere. I mean, there's so much already, there's certain conditions and properties already assigned to these places. So again, I think the spatial capital term is rather good because there is certain capital already there. directing things in certain directions. And even though it may be a place where you have not very much built at the moment, it's an open space and so forth, the context and the what's going on around and so forth, the locations surrounding the site that you want to develop are so important in directing what can happen and so forth. So I think the path dependency is something we really should learn to acknowledge more, because I think that we too often in urban planning think of ourselves as, breaking new grounds and creating new qualities and all of that, when really the city is already pointing out what's possible and not and so forth. So I think that's it's very important. Which again I think could change a bit how we think about urban planning and so forth, that it's more about taking care of what's there and trying to fix the things that are not working, rather than we think that we're creating a new city and so forth. It's all done. But of course, it can also be then, if we really want to change that, maybe many cities are in that at that moment today, when one really want to redirect the city into new, more sustainable trajectories, whatever we mean by that. And then you maybe need to address some fundamental dimensions of the already present city to make this happen. But again, I think what the kind of modeling we are doing, you could identify the critical places where the changes need to take place to achieve such redirection of the city, rather than searching for it in a dark room, so to speak. Now we can see where the critical instances could be and where really things could be making a difference. But I would really underline the importance of first acknowledging the path dependency of cities, but also at times recognizing it as a good thing. Again, the path dependency is kind of similar to the idea of resilience, right? So there may be disturbances, there may be a lot of things happening, but still there's a certain path dependency that keep on going until the moment when we really want to change the path. And then we need to do it. But then we need to know and identify more precisely what we need to do to achieve that. So yes, very good. I think good questions, I must say.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. It's really a pleasure, and we hope that we have some sort of collaboration, maybe between our lab and yours, if we may, of course. And it's really a pleasure having you. And it was like 1 hour and 40 minutes, which is run very quickly. We've enjoyed every minute. And congratulations again for your new book. It's really, really interesting and inspiring, and a must read.
Thank you, Nabil. It's been a pleasure being here, and not least discussing with you. Very, very good and important questions, I think. So thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, and thanks for the participants who have just been with us at the last minute. And we enjoyed having you all with us. And see you all in our next webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.